Happy Wednesday. It is October 22nd, and this is an episode of Here's What I Know. And an episode that I dug my heels in and have insisted will be today's episode. But I will admit I'm struggling in terms of how to get started. As I mentioned in the last episode, I had begun a book. Yeah. I started a book a few months back and realized, actually, I think almost a year ago, now that I think about it, and a few months back, realized that rather than a book, I want to go ahead and turn those chapters that I had done, which was just a few, into podcast episodes. And one of those was titled Being Born. I think at the time, the intention was to give some context in terms of who I am today and where that came from, or at least, in telling the origin story, providing a little bit of insight as to maybe who I am as an individual in terms of how I interact with others, choices I've made, behaviors, etc. And I think at the time, the idea was to go somewhat chronological in telling stories about my experiences. I keep wanting to say my life, but that sounds very self-important. Like, who am I? Right? It's not like a autobiography of somebody that people know and has made significant contributions. I think of that as the purpose of an autobiography, is to tell the story of someone that you're interested in their story. But if I'm about to launch into a hopefully long-running podcast that's designed to try to help others navigate life in ways that nobody helped me or I had limited assistance with, I guess it makes sense to know where that's coming from or why that's even something that's important to me. So I've tried launching into this episode, I want to say 3 or 4 times so far, and I keep getting tripped up on the fact that I want to tell the story, or I want to speak to the chapter the way I wrote it. And that's really hard. As I mentioned in the last episode, I can't do a script. I'm just horrible with that. I guess freewheeling is the way to go for me. And so to try to follow along with the chapter I wrote is not serving me well. So I'm just going to jump into it. I was born out of wedlock. I jokingly refer to myself as a bastard. So I'm sorry if that offends others, but it's my truth. So I guess I can joke a bit about it. My mother had been married, had 2 kids, got divorced in I guess it'd be the 50s, 60s. And my siblings, I think, were in their teens. Well, I know they were because my sister was 17 years older than me and my brother was 15 years older. And they were my half brother and sister. So my mom had been married to a gentleman named Lou, got divorced or was getting divorced, and then met my father. And 9 months later, here comes little Heather. Interestingly, the last name that I was given at birth was that of my mother's ex-husband, not my father. I mean, he was not my father. I'm not sure why that is. And I'll talk more about my mom later, but she passed in 2010. So I can't ask her some of these questions that I wished I'd asked when I was younger. But my mom, whose name was Eleanor, was, as I said, mom of 2 kids prior to me, Denise and Michael. And Denise was 17 years older. My brother Michael was 15 years older. And some of the first memories I have of my mother are really from around the time I was a toddler, I guess. And I'm guessing about 3, 4 years old. I mapped that out because I know I left her or went into foster care long term at 5 years old. So, like many of us, I don't remember my baby years. I mean, I don't even have any fleeting memories really of that. But I start to have memories around the time that we lived in this project style apartment complex in upstate New York, and, have some pretty solid memories there. Some very neutral, some very bad. But I want to say at this point, I don't think my mom had any business having any more children I think when my brother and sister were little, I think she was momly. I know that she did have some issues with anxiety, mental health, and she had those issues back in the day when they would truck your ass off to a mental hospital. And I think she had a couple stints at the mental hospital. And it wasn't because she had severe mental health issues. It was when anxiety, depression, bipolar, none of that was really, I don't think, talked about mainstream. So I was born in December of 1969. My mom was 40. So you can do the math as to, the time period that she was a young adult, a middle-aged adult, and a mom, and then having mental health issues at that time. I do know, I remember when I did spend time with her in my teens, I feel like that woman popped Valium like Tic Tacs. And Valium was the thing then, right? I've actually, interestingly, never taken a Valium. I think I was given it once when I was at the dentist, but I've never taken it for its intended purpose. I might have to check it out sometime. My mom's mental health issues, I now can look back and say she just had crap coping skills. The woman was extremely intelligent, as in either she was in the Mensa Society or was on the fringes of being qualified to be part of the Mensa Society. And for anybody who doesn't know what that is, I'll let you go ahead and Google it. But it is essentially a society or a group, an organization for people with high IQs. This woman was smart. She was very smart, but that doesn't necessarily mean she had good coping skills. And I think that's where the problem was. I have no idea if she was a victim of any kind of SA. I I mean, statistically speaking, especially the older generations, I mean, I feel like the odds are high. I know that my sister was. I have a feeling my brother was. I was. So statistically speaking, maybe some of her mental health issues did come from some abuse, some trauma. I will say that some of the biggest regrets, it's not really a regret because it's nothing I chose, but I really would love to talk with her about some of these things now. At the time of the interactions or the time we spent together, it didn't dawn on me to ask these things. And that just comes with wisdom. I talked about that in the last episode. The very nature of wisdom is having a different perspective, looking at things a little bit differently, and maybe having some curiosities you didn't have. Well, I say that's the product of wisdom or time or getting older. I will say one of the most shocking things to me as an adult is that not everyone is nicer, kinder, smarter, wiser as they get older. Some people are absolute douchebags right up to the end. And that came to as a surprise to me. I think as a kid, I just thought as you got older, you became a better person. Um, and as it turns out, that's not always the case. Some people, as they get older, they just get worse at being a horrible human being. But we'll talk about that later. My mom was actually a very nice lady. Like I said, she was very smart, very funny, talented. I think when she had me, she wanted to have a child because, I mean, she's a nice lady and who doesn't love babies? I'm not sure it was the right call. And what I mean by that is, I mean, I'm not going to say I wish I wasn't born here. And we've all seen It's a Wonderful Life, or most of us have, right? And your life touches so many. So if I wasn't born, maybe someone else wouldn't have benefited from something I've done intentionally, inadvertently, unknowingly. So it's not to say that I regret being born. I just think that had she made different choices for herself, for me, it probably would have been, well, it definitely would have been a different turnout. It's really hard to go back and say, if this had been done, then this would be better, right? Because the devil you know is better than the one you don't. I mean, maybe had she given me up for adoption when I was an infant, I could have landed with people that were just horrible, horrible, evil people. My toddler years in my childhood were tumultuous at best. So, in not giving me up, or at least giving me up permanently, and I'll talk about that in a minute, it did create trauma for me, and it did create difficulties that are unfortunate. I know one of the things I touch on in the chapter was the idea of being protected, and that many people whose job it was to protect me just didn't. And she was the first one in that list, at top of the list. Not because she was an uncaring person, she just didn't have the tools. And that is going to be a topic for next week, because it's something I'm very passionate about, that you cannot expect people to make better decisions, make good choices when they don't have the raw material to know the difference. I think that's something that people have very strong opinions about and will more than likely disagree, or at least lots of folks will disagree. But I'll put some more to that next week. But I don't think my mom had the tools to be a great mom. So with that, after I was born, I think she had me for a couple of years. Then she put me in up for adoption or in foster care. I'm not quite certain the timeline. I do know that there was a point before the age of 5 that there was a couple who wanted to adopt me. And I kind of remember being there. Actually, the one blazing memory that I've just held on to for years is they had one of those in the door water dispensers, which back then was a big damn deal. Like, you were super bougie if you had that. My sister tells me that in the time I stayed with them, they bought me a boatload of Carter's, the children's clothing, which again, at that time, that was bougie, that was expensive. So this is a well-to-do couple that wanted to adopt me. They had named me Helen. I don't know if I just said that. And my sister had told me that they were just pleading with her to talk my mom into letting them adopt me. Well, that didn't happen. It would be super interesting to find those people today. I wouldn't even know how, although there's probably some kind of record somewhere in New York State. Anywho, so she got me back. Things weren't great. She put me back up for placement. And I think at that point it became foster care. I don't know that there was any time where it wasn't her choice. Often foster kids are in the system because they were removed because of neglect, abuse, etc. I do believe that each and every time it was her decision, that she couldn't handle having a child. So there's a few foster homes that I vaguely remember details. I remember one in particular. I remember where the house is. To this day, I can drive down that road and point that house out. But what I remember the most is that if I was caught lying, I think it was lying, doing something bad, they would make me kneel on the floor grate, the register that sends up forced hot air out of the floor. They would make me kneel on that. And I had to be probably 3 or 4 years old, because I was 5 when I ended up at a long-term placement. I'll talk about it in a minute. So I had to be young. That and the refrigerator thing are really kind of the only couple of things that I remember before I landed at the Hills. So around the age of 5, I distinctly remember Mr. Krebs, who was my mom's boss and attorney, and maybe more, I don't know, because I have other memories of being at his house and her showering there, so that's weird. I don't know if it was because we were staying there. I remember bunk beds and some older girls, like teenage girls, and everybody was nice to me. So no bad memories of that, just spotty. But Mr. Krebs brought me to my foster family that I ended up staying with for several years, and their name was the Hills. And I remember very vividly the drive, the last kind of half mile down the road that they lived on, and passing by these hay fields. It was summer, but these full, lush hay fields, and looking over at him I was in the passenger seat, which these days no one lets a 5-year-old just sit in the passenger seat without well, at all, right? Without or a booster seat or, but this was 1975, I think, or 76. So we get to the house and there's all these people around to greet me. And I can, to this day, kind of close my eyes and picture that room and picture those people. I also very vividly remember this huge gray suitcase that had everything in, everything, because I was going to live with them. I don't know now if it was live with them permanently, as in they were definitely going to adopt me, or if it was meant to just be foster care. So I get to the hills. It is Beverly. Norman is the dad, and then there are sisters and a little brother. It turns out the sisters were her sisters. Beverly was one of 13 brothers and sisters, and her youngest 3 sisters were staying with her when I arrived. I think just those 3, as far as her siblings. And then the little boy was a year and a half younger than me. His name was Normie. And for the next 5 years plus, and I say plus because there was some off and on or back and forth, that was my family. And you'll hear me refer to my foster family, my foster mom, and that's what I'm talking about. It wasn't a long time, but for a kid, that's a long time. I have some absolutely great memories from that time in my life and a few not so great. But if not for landing there, I think I would have turned out differently. I think that the life I had led up till then and whatever trauma that resulted in, if I hadn't landed someplace solid and consistent, it could have gone badly. I do believe in the theory of old souls. I mean, I'm not even sure I believe in souls, but the idea that you're born with a particular constitution. And that's not a word used often these days, but the way I define it is your toughness, your strength, ability to persevere, your resilience. It's I the best I can come up with, it's your strength versus weakness. And I think it's on a graded level of sliding. It's you're either born with the capacity to deal with a lot of shit, or you're born with a very limited capacity. Well, I guess the first version would be a high capacity, right? And the second scenario, and then everywhere in between, is you have no capacity to deal with adversity. And then, of course, there's the nature part of that, right? So the first part is the nature. Nature. The second part is nurture. So nature versus nurture, that's an age-old conversation about which one plays a bigger impact, I think, in who you become, or plays a bigger role, has a bigger impact. In my case, I have no choice but to believe that I was born with a high capacity for adversity, and then combined with a few people in my childhood that helped me along the way, whether that was through consistency, structure, security, or love, understanding, whatever combination. As I'm saying that, I think I attribute the most of the consistency, security, structure to Beverly and the time I spent on the farm, and the caring, the understanding, the love to my sister Denise. So around this time, we figure I'm 5, so she's 20-ish. I would say more around the time I was about 10, 11, 12 is when I started to spend time with my sister, her husband, and eventually their young daughter. They lived not far up the street, the road. I mean, I lived in the country, so it was up the road. And there were times where she would have me come over, spend some time, hang out, but also babysit for her. In addition to spending time with Eleanor. So all this time that I was at Beverly's house, for a lot of years, I thought I had been in foster care. Well, actually, when I was really little, I thought I was adopted. And then somewhere along the way, someone said, "Oh, no, you're still just a foster kid." I'm guessing you could see why I vividly remember that. As it turns out, and I now know after finding some paperwork after Beverly passed, they did adopt me. They adopted me. I had their last name, which now tracks because I remember thinking, how could they give me their last name? Because at one point my last name was Hill. But how could they do that if I was just in foster care? I mean, they technically could, but it's a little unusual. It turns out they did adopt me. But somewhere along the way, Eleanor pleaded to get me back. And they agreed. And she did. And it was a shit show because Eleanor, I mean, she was, like I said, a very nice, sweet woman, but she just couldn't deal. So I get to the Hills at 5. Somewhere, I think around the age of 9 or 10, I start having visits with my mom. And it was a reunification type scenario, which I now know that terminology or the idea of that. And eventually I did go live with her. And then, like I said, went to shit. She couldn't handle it. She called up social services and said, "Come get her. I can't handle it." And then I went back to live with the Hills. So from the time I was 5 to, I want to say 12, 13, that was the case, this back and forth. And then I did go live with my mom, and it stuck until I was 17. And at 17, but I want to say it was only a couple years. So I think, 10, 11, 12, somewhere around that age, I'm doing the visits. And then when I'm 12, 13, I'm back with Beverly, maybe 14, 15, 16, somewhere there, or shortly after, I go back and live with my mom. And it was from my mom's home that I ventured off into the world on my own, a little back and forth, but nothing significant. And so I've been on my own since I was 17. It's funny when I say I've been on my own since I was 17, from the time I was 17, that sounds better. It really makes me think about the idea that to a certain degree, I've been on my own since I was very little. And by that, I mean, I think I felt like I was on my own. I had to take care of myself or my, not so much in the literal sense, right? Not, food and clothing and shelter, but to protect myself, my mental state, I can't even say personal safety, because when you're that age, you don't know what it is that you need to protect. That's what you're supposed to be provided in those years, and you learn what that is. But I don't think it's a big stretch to kind of imagine what I'm talking about, that you become self-reliant when you realize that all the people around you are not doing that for you. They're not giving you someone to lean on, someone that's going to ensure that you're safe. In the time I was with my mother, my biological mom, and I want to say those toddler years, or it is the time around living at that complex, is when the memory of the sexual abuse comes in. I will say that the clarity around that time might not be there, but that memory, that kind of flash in your brain that a thing happened, is still as fresh as it's always been. And all I really remember is being made to do things that no toddler should do. And it was my half brother and one of his friends. And then years later, I think there was a situation where there may have been some inappropriate interactions with a neighbor. But for the most part, my memory locks just to that one time frame at my mother's apartment. But it was enough that as a child, I think there were, behavioral issues. I was a bedwetter for quite a few years into being at least preteen. Well, I wouldn't say quite a few years. I think maybe 10, 11, which again, that's a long time. But I learned later on that that was a defense mechanism that is typically used, or I guess tapped into, by kids that have been victims of SA. I would venture to say that that abuse is also what informed a certain sense of self-worth. I think that, combined with just being in the situations I was in, being a foster kid, shuffled around. In my teens and early 20s, it was important to be accepted, liked. I'm not saying that that's any different than I think most human beings. There's a point where being accepted by our peers, being accepted by boys, being accepted by girls is very, very important. I think in my case, it drove behavior that, had I not had quite such a traumatic start, I would have not been so inclined to behave the way that I did. And nothing was horrible. I never picked up a drug habit. I never went to jail. I didn't fight. It wasn't anything too severe. But I certainly didn't have a lot of self-respect. The way in which I was with boys or men in my 20s, I wasn't with boys in my 20s. My point is that the way I was with boys when I was, the same age as boys, and then how I was with men in my 20s and maybe even a little into my 30s was an absolute 100% result of the way I felt about myself in terms of self-respect, and the battle that wanting to be accepted and wanting to be loved and approved of can just trump self-respect every day. There are so many pieces of my childhood that I'm sure along the way I'll share, but that's pretty much the lay of the land. That's pretty much the gist of how I got started, where I landed as a 20-something adult, and I'll talk more about the years following. But the back and forth, in and out of foster care, broken relationship, estranged relationship with my mother, a not always great relationship with my foster parents, that made me. That time frame colored who I have become, or at least who I became. And since then, it's been self-improvement, self-reflection, self-awareness, self-respect that I've needed to grow. I am struggling a bit with how to round this out. And maybe that's normal or natural or to be expected, because there isn't really a round out kind of thing you can do here, other than to say, that's my story, good or bad, interesting or not. I guess where I want to land with this is that all of that brought me to today, to here, to the way I move about the world, how I interact with others, how I treat myself. And here's the thing I've come to believe. Beginnings don't dictate endings. You can come from chaos, from brokenness, from absolute uncertainty, and still build a life that feels peaceful or joyful or even just yours. You don't have to repeat the story you were handed. You get to write your own. And maybe that's the whole point of being born, not just once, but over and over again. So if you're listening and you've ever wondered whether your past is too messy or too complicated or too far gone to rewrite, it's not. You're not broken. You're just mid-chapter. And honestly, some of the best stories have a few plot twists. So that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Thank you for sticking through this. Talk about an exercise in stick-to-itiveness. If this one resonated with you, or maybe it just made you think a little differently about your own beginning, share it, send it to someone who might need to hear it, or just sit with it for a bit. We'll pick back up on Friday, which is scheduled to be a fun Friday, much, much lighter topic. And I promised Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'm doing this thing. And And that's me applying some accountability. Until then, take care of yourself, breathe, maybe even give yourself a little credit for the version that you've got to this far. So be nice to yourself, be nice to others, even if they're assholes. Thanks for listening, and come see me again on Here's What I Know.